The main problem is description and self-description, not political, but a cultural problem, and how we describe any phenomenon. We have some general schemes, according to which all happy families are alike, but we decline and see all families are somehow unhappy, and are unhappy in their own way. I wish to discuss the main problems of how we describe the process, and what mistakes we encounter, the conflicts between the language of politics and the language of political science, how the culture describes itself, self-describes, and how it's described from outside. This is the main problem. What usually happens is that the system has a memory on past forms and past states and potential feeling, anticipation of the future. It's very important to see how self-description of the culture occurs, how it adds a layer of self-organization, but this description, of course, is not consistent with the reality. We may even see somewhat of a clash. I wish to see then, subsequently, in the post-Soviet societies, how their description is based on this scheme, which scientifically, of course, is wrong, because we have a model, a mold, that is the a priori mold, whereby society should move from point A to point B. It's outlined in a certain theory. It was communism before the 19th century, and more concrete here, the third wave theory of Huntington, which subsequently, according to the existing descriptions, is justified based on the mold that we know. So 3 concepts and a transition. We're all in a transition period. It's used by the politicians. We're moving to a bright future, and it has 3 elements: liberalization, democratization, and consolidation. The magic formula that all post-Soviet societies have to go through. It's in the official discourse, because any political force says where it's going, it points at the bright future. It's been not working well, so an emerging hybrid regime and the concept of a revolution in recent times, and how we understand it and how justified it is in the case of Armenia. All these schemes imply a certain beginning, a path, and some sort of a conclusion. Last year's conference here shows that this idea actually prevails, that this transition should somehow graduate, conclude. So it implies a dynamic transition from a Soviet communist past to an ideal state of affairs that can be found abroad, to take the place of the discredited state of communism. But generally this idea was outlined in Fukuyama's well-known paper called The End of History. Now, how is this different? It's an old archetypical model, different from the classical source. Instead of divine power on earth, a general liberal society to be created according to the Testament. The end of time, time is over. That's when the time will end. Then going back 2 centuries, the great Russian satiric history terminates its speech, and the story of one Sidi Nassim mystery stops its course. This is not only my observation, it can also be seen with many well-known authors. I use Alan Supio's idea, which shows that in today's modern society is how the transition takes place to not the new future, but a feudal system. It indicates another idea which replaces Marxist communism with a new utopia. Going back to Lockman, this depends on the schemes of description, where the course of history is described as a struggle between the black and white forces. Eventually the white forces are triumphant, and no historic process will ever again occur. It's used here in 92. Lockman predicted the outcome of this system because it is a systemic problem and not the failure of any one particular state. Now, as you see, another quote by Lockman. Don't know if you know Fukuyama's work, but very much analyzing change. Timon Oxman wrote an article that I'm quoting here. After the collapse of communism, 20 years passed, the aforementioned trends of post-communist regime development have become stable, and we can agree on some conclusions. Reading the text cannot follow. He then goes on with specific examples of theories that failed. Despite all these predictions failing, the paradigm is supposed to be viable. It just needs to be reformed. Let us now turn to some other outcomes. So if there is a transition, how far does it go? Quoting Marvel's article of 2015, it's moving in very different directions. So the transition is not to democracy, but rather to a very different state, which may lead to not consolidated democracy, but rather consolidated autocracy. Armenia is here, cluster 4 examples of transformation, influenced mostly by decisions and actions of the political actors. Inability or unwillingness to look for compromise, avoid violence, fear of open political competition, fear to lose, and including property law, led to the emergence of hybrid regimes with an uncertain future. Written in 2015, but in a way typical also of the current status quo. The transition idea is replaced with another idea which is methodologically quite flawed. It's the hybrid regime that is meant to adjust the metaphor of transit. It's another metaphor. It preserves the opposition between the bad past and the beautiful, bright future, but instead of the idea of annihilation of the past institutions and their gradual replacement by westernized institutions, the concept of hybrid regimes assumes the possibility of their cohabitation. These theories thus pretend to take into account the specifics of various states and offer different models for describing the political situation, such as Estonia and Tajikistan. This is also flawed because all regimes are really authoritarian regimes. Quoting Hansen, if we say different regimes, we mean nothing. They are still authoritarian regimes. And this depends on the description. For example, if we try to describe a car as a model, using a car as a model to describe a cart, we will inevitably be describing the cart as a hybrid car. But some features are, of course, alike, but the cart doesn't become a car. Hansen uses roughly the same example. Playing dog would have been classified as a hybrid dog. If it's playing with thread because it's a hybrid dog, something between a dog and a cat because no one knows what evolution will lead to. So if in an authoritarian system there is a free press, it doesn't make it a hybrid regime. Merrill and others reached the same conclusion. Hybrid regime is another label. Now, what is happening in Armenia? Back in 2008, I proposed a term, and Mr. Voskanyan referred to it today, electoral feudalism. Which is where people are given the right to choose their feudals. And in the Middle Ages, it could be found in Russia, in the Venice Republic, in others, where there is some sort of a coexistence between the oligarchic system and the system of elections. So looking at the post-Soviet situation, neutralizing these features of the socialist system doesn't automatically lead to any new phenomena. It revives the old ones. We will come back to Armenia later, but this transition to feudalism is typical of not only post-Soviet countries, but also Western democracies. So I skip Armenia, and this is Crouch's definition of what is post-democracy. Not for Armenia, not for Russia, but the example of Great Britain. The main problem there in that post-democracy is similar to electoral feudalism, because people retain the right via election to change their government. They retain the right, but the system remains a feudalist one, like in Russia, the feudal could be changed. Similarly, Crouch says this can happen also in the British system, and for him, it's the return to the new Middle Age. There are some other circumstances. The market economy, in case of globalization. On the other hand, looking at the legal system, Crouch looks at the economic system, but looking at the legal system, and French author Alain Soupieu's theory, he speaks about re-feudalization, again pointing at the difference, but also the similarities between the modern legal system, in which the public domain is also privatized, and we talk about democracy on non-democracy. Crouch says we refuse this, we reject this idea. Post-democracy is a much more complex idea that includes also democratic elements, but it's no longer democracy. It's more of a feudal system in disguise, he says. Neo-feudalism is then Theodor description, and how he characterizes the American political system. All three authors tie it to globalization. There are also differences in the grounds of legitimacy. For new feudalism, it doesn't come from God. It's not some sort of way of legitimizing divine or God-given power, but rather and more a chain of consumption which coordinates the relationship between the societies, and it is what determines It's also defined by the international monopolies, transnational monopolies. Mr. Voskanyan spoke about contractualism in his idea. For Supio, that's a feature of feudalization. We see a vassalage relationship, which in the Western tradition is formulated in legal contract. This is the main structure or foundation of these new societies. And the next feature, Mr. Voskanyan, you recalled Mabel Sargsyan's criminal oligarchic system, from a strong authoritarian one to a criminal oligarchic system in European terms. We could characterize it as a transition from the sovereign to the suzerain, because the sovereign rules over everyone, the suzerain, the vassal, my vassal's vassal is not my vassal. So everyone has their domain, and Supio says that there is, in a legal system, a transition from a centralized government system to the feudal system. Now, turning to the Velvet Revolution at the very end of this speech, I want to quote my good friend Mikhail Ilyin's idea, who thinks that there aren't democratic regimes, that all these regimes are authoritarian given their institutional nature. They're only different in terms of their practices, them being democratic or non-democratic. He uses the monarchies as an example. Sweden, Great Britain, Saudi Arabia, all monarchies, but different practices. So if you look at the change, what has changed? I didn't make any change yet. Of course, I would need to respond to the existing changes. I'm convinced that the legal system in Armenia remains the same. The practices only have changed. What's changed? There's now trust, confidence. It's clear, and we'll speak a lot about the existence of confidence. There's trust, faith, typical a-feudal. Elimination of taxes and penalties, which is anti-feudal in the revolution, and the revision of the classes, and a parade implying revision of the roles. That's what we're seeing, and the example is this statement by Nikol Pashinyan. There's a lack of ideology, emerges utopia. The revolution is a utopian, dream-like thing. The people of Armenia, the Armenian citizens, carried out Velvet Revolution that enhanced the boundaries of the human potential. Sounds beautiful, but utopian, of course. And this has become reality. What many people considered impossible, what was impossible, is now possible. Revolutionary pathos, and we are on the path of making the impossible possible. In the Soviet era, we were born to turn fairy tales into reality. What will be the future? Main elements of the program: we're no longer feudals. So the feudal practices, the vassal paying, will be eliminated. No interest, no monthly fees on large businesses. How much paid to the Prime Minister? 0, 0, 0. So I agree with Professor Arishan. This was not a revolution, it was an uprising, a victorious uprising, which eliminated the old taxes and duties. And it's not new to Armenia. In these utopian dreams were also brought up by Ser Sargsyan, but people didn't believe him, so nobody read his campaign program. He said, in safe Armenia, each one of us must be able to accomplish our dreams, achieve our personal, family, and national objectives, and leave in the past the faulty practices, the class of the privileged, the monopolies. And this quote could easily belong to the current Prime Minister. This is my final one before I conclude. Much has already been said. I just need to read more carefully. According to Croce, democratization and democratic elements, either in the beginning or in case of a crisis of the regime. So if the regime is more consolidated, if it's on its feet, you need to expect, I wouldn't say for sure, it's an assumption. So in this case, it's from a different field. The price paid for utopia is discovered only at a subsequent stage. Stephen Hansen, and then the final one. Despite Fukuyama's theory, biological and social evolution have not fully stopped. The process will evolve according to its logic and the theory of choice, a theory of selection, any classical theory. We cannot avoid these patterns, the turbulence, which is still possible. We need to be ready. I'm not pessimistic, I'm just precautionary. As the classic says, it's certainly coming, and if we turn a blind eye to all of it, we will again encounter serious problems. As written by Charens, Armenia's uncertain escort in the boulevards of history, optimistic where the crowds were crazy moving to the sun. We have a path, but not the way.